Aí galera que curte Engenharia Clínica, hoje eu estou fazendo mais um vídeo para dar uma força para o pessoal da Oxygen Alliance, que é uma aliança de profissionais técnicos interessados em ensinar como fazer a manutenção de concentradores de oxigênio. Então muitas vezes você tem um concentrador de oxigênio que está gerando oxigênio, mas quando você vai medir a concentração, por exemplo, essa concentração está abaixo do parâmetro esperado. Então tem várias coisas que podem acontecer e no vídeo de hoje o Mwabi Lungu vai descrever como é que eu troco um kit, como é que é o kit de reparo de um compressor. É um compressor Thomas. Muitos aqui não conhecem no Brasil a Thomas Américas, que fabrica compressores. Tem algumas máquinas, ou algumas poucas máquinas do Brasil, eles vieram para cá, mas acabaram não se difundindo. Mas nos concentradores da Devilbes, por exemplo, da Arcep, você encontra esse tipo de compressor. Apesar de haver diferenças, não são significativos. Então, bora rodar a vinheta para a gente mostrar como que o pessoal da Oxygen Alliance pode ajudar nós, né? Nós que temos interesse nesse tipo de tecnologia. Só que assim, antes de falar o vídeo, só para dar mais um salve. Toda quinta-feira, 9 horas, tem o Oxygen Concentrator Talk, um bate-papo sobre concentradores. Você manda um e-mail para eles com as suas dúvidas e na próxima quinta-feira eles vão tratar esse problema. Você pode participar sem custo. Depois eles postam no canal da Oxygen Alliance, no YouTube, eles acabam postando. Então, se você perdeu alguma coisa, você pode ir lá assistir e continuar. Então, agora sim, bora rodar a vinheta e aprender como é que faz a troca desse kit.
Hello there, so my name is Mwabi Lungu and today I'm going to be explaining how to service the compressor from an Nesse concentrator. So the model that I'll be working on today is a 2660 model that is commonly found in Aircep and Devilbes 515 concentrators. So there are multiple models of compressors and the process of servicing them is pretty much the same. So just make sure that you have the right tools for the screws on that particular model. So in order to check if the compressor is performing at its best or not, there are steps that we take in order to check for the performance, and we are going to talk about that in one of our upcoming videos. So in order to service the compressor, you need to have the right tools and the replacement service kits. So the tools that you need include a small flat screwdriver. So we use this one to remove the old head gasket and the O-ring from the compressor. And then secondly, we have the T25 Torx tip. So we use this one to unscrew some of the screws on the compressor. And then we also have the T27 Torx tip. So we also use this to unscrew some of the screws on the compressor. And then we have the ratchet and a 6mm socket. So this is the one that we use to hold the tip and then remove the screws from the compressor. Yeah, and then we have the Sharpie. So we use the Sharpie to mark the compressor so that when we remove the head of the compressor, we know which side was facing the front and which side was facing the back. So I would recommend that you get this red toolbox because this one has all the different type of tips that you need: the Torx, the Allen key, the Phillips, and the flat. So once you get this, you will have everything that you need. For the replacement service kits, you must have the cylinder sleeve, which is where the compression takes place, and then you also need the cylinder cap. So the cylinder cap goes inside the cylinder sleeve and is there to provide a tight seal inside the cylinder sleeve during suction and compression. Then you must have the O-ring. So the O-ring sits between the cylinder sleeve and the valve plate and is there to provide a tight seal. Then next we have the head gasket. So the head gasket sits between the valve plate and the compressor head. And then lastly, we have the 4 reed valves. So these are responsible for channeling air into the cylinder sleeve during suction and out of the cylinder sleeve during compression. So now that we have everything, we can jump on to servicing the compressor. Begin with, make sure that you mark the head of the compressor with a Sharpie so that you know which side is the front and which one is the back. So make sure you mark the top of the head and the side of the compressor. Right, so after marking the compressor, then you can now move on to removing the head of the compressor so that we gain access to the rest of the components. So I am using a Torx 25 tip to remove the screws, but then the type of screw varies across the different model of compressors that you might come across. So it could be Allen key, it could be flat or Phillips, so just make sure that you have the right tools for the job. So this might take some bit of time. Can now lift up the head and then it comes off nicely. So depending on how long the thing has been running, sometimes the valve plate can stick to the top of the sleeve, but then you can just pull that out. So from there now we'll move on to removing the cylinder cap. So in order to remove the cylinder cap, you need to unscrew the screw on top of the valve plate. So in order to do that, you use a T27 Torx tip. So once you remove the screws, you can then now slide out the cylinder sleeve, and then you can see that the cap retainer comes out together with the cylinder cap. So you can see the level of damage on the cylinder cap. So this one has been running for a very long time, and we can see that the side is almost peeling off on the cylinder cap, so we need to change this. And then we can also see on the other side it's the same thing, visible damage, and then the side is almost peeling off as well. So if we also look at the cylinder sleeve, we can also see the wear that we have inside. So depending on how long the compressor has been running, you can see how much damage has been caused. Right, so now we have seen the damage that we have, and we need to replace these components with the new components that we have. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to press the caps, the cylinder caps inside the cylinder sleeve. So you can see we have the new cylinder sleeves here. And then we have the new cylinder caps and the cylinder sleeve as well. So in order to press the cylinder sleeve inside the cylinder cap inside the cylinder sleeve, you need to place the cylinder cap on the cap retainer, and then that will help you to nicely press the cylinder cap inside the cylinder sleeve. So you need to be very careful when doing this because you might risk damaging the cap. So as you can see here, our cylinder cap is now sliding inside the cylinder sleeve. So once you do that, we can now fit it on top of the piston rod, and then try to align it. So you can see on the back we have a small notch, so that notch goes on top of the piston rod. So make sure that you align that notch with the hole on the cylinder rod. So this takes a bit of time sometimes, but then when you're lucky it just drops in first time. But then when you push it in, make sure that you try and rotate it so that you can feel that it's nicely tight and has fallen inside the notch. So once that happens, you can now replace the screw back on top. So when replacing the screw, make sure you don't tighten it the first time, because you need to check and make sure that the cap retainer isn't rotating and that it's locked into place. And once you feel that it's nicely locked into place, you can now tighten it up so that it doesn't get loose when the compressor is running. So once you place that in, you can try and rotate it a bit just to see if the piston cap is nicely aligned inside the cylinder sleeve. Alright, so now we move on to the second cylinder sleeve. Now that we have finished replacing the cylinder sleeves, we can now move on to changing the flapper valves. So for the flapper valves, normally you can actually sometimes see a visible damage on it, but on this one we don't have too much damage, but then it's advised to change the flapper valves each time you service the compressor. So we are also going to make the changes. So in order to remove the flapper valves, you need a 6mm socket, which is the same one that we use on our ratchet. The flapper valve has a washer below it, on top of it, so just make sure that you keep that safe. Don't throw it away because it goes back when you are replacing it with a new one. Okay, so I'll use a flat screwdriver to try and remove this one. It seems it got stuck. So once you remove the flapper valve, you can then take a dry cloth and then wipe out all the dirt that was around the area where the flapper valve was. So once it's nice and clean, you can now get the new flapper valve and then place it where the old flapper valve was. Then we take our washer again and then place it on top. We can put back the screw that we removed. So make sure that when screwing down the flapper valve, the washer is nicely aligned with the length of the flapper valve, and then the flapper valve also is nicely aligned with where the used up flapper valve was. Alright, so once you are satisfied with that, you can now move on to the second flapper valve, which is below the cap retainer. Once you are satisfied with the other side, you can now move on to changing the flapper valve on the next one. We'll now jump on to changing the head gasket. So if it's easier to remove, you can just peel it off, but then if you're having trouble peeling it off, then you can use a flat screwdriver to remove the head gasket. So we now get the new head gaskets, and then you put it where we had the old head gaskets. So you also do the same for the O-ring, but then we examined this one and we saw that we didn't have any damage on the O-ring, so we just maintained the same O-ring that was there originally. So after that, you can now then place the valve plates on top of the cylinder sleeve. So once you feel that it is in place, you can now place the second valve plate on the other side. Alright, so now that we have our valve plates on top of the compressor, you can just try to rotate the compressor and make sure that everything is rotating nicely while holding down the valve plate. And once you are satisfied that everything is okay, you can now replace your compressor head back on top of the compressor. So remember the markings that we made at the beginning, so make sure those markings align with the markings that we made on the side of the compressor. So this way you'll be sure that you have the right side facing where it's supposed to be facing. Once you replace the compressor head, you can now put the screws back in the original place, and then you screw them up. So now we're finished screwing down our compressor, and then you can just try to rotate it so that you feel if it's rotating nicely. So you can actually hear a hissing sound when you rotate the compressor. So that tells you that everything now is working perfectly. So this was a step-by-step process of how to service an air compressor, and as I said at the beginning, the steps are similar across most of the model of compressor that you are going to come across. So all you need to do is have the right tools that will enable you to successfully make the change of all the components that we need. So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you in our next video tutorial.
Bom, pessoal, é isso aí. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Não se esqueça, toda quinta-feira, 9 horas, existe o Concentrator Talk. Basta você mandar um e-mail para info@oxygenalliance.com que eles vão mandar o convite para você poder participar ao vivo, se assim necessário. Você pode levar seu concentrador, mostrar uma parte, uma peça. Tudo isso, você vai ter um grupo de pessoas interessadas em ajudar você como subir essa máquina de novo, fazê-la funcionar do jeito que tem que ser. Então é isso aí, e no mais, daquele muito obrigado pelo seu tempo. Valeu!